Greetings and good morning. I know I've been inactive for about a month now. Honestly, I've been quite busy offline and I remain busy, so I'm going to continue to be somewhat inactive. But I hope to get back into the swing of things soon, maybe, I don't know, in the next few weeks or something like that. Whatever the case, in the meantime, I wanted to put out a really quick video which shares a brief thought on a couple of things I've recently seen. Perhaps we might consider this a small yet potentially significant piece of the larger puzzle, which is the ongoing discussion about the pews. The first thing I want to touch on is this public Facebook post I came across while doing a keyword search for posts relevant to the topic of the markings on the pews at First African Baptist Church in Savannah, Georgia. A woman who had apparently visited the church multiple times in her life was posting her thoughts on Henry Louis Gates' recent documentary for PBS titled The Black Church, which had a brief segment on the pews. What caught my eye in particular was a comment the author made in the comment section of the thread. While at the start of the thread, she noted a more recent visit to the church in which the tour guide claimed Hebrew and Aramaic appeared on the pews, she recounted an earlier visit, her first visit when she was a kid, and noted that back then, quote, folks at the church were like, no, it's just drawings, end quote. Her claim struck me as interesting as here we have an apparent witness to a time from decades ago when some at the church were simply describing the markings as drawings and not identifying them with a specific language. Now, you can interpret that however you wish, but I personally found it interesting. And moreover, the statement began to strike me as even more interesting shortly thereafter when I recently watched an interview on the Boom Church YouTube account. The video is from the 31st of May, and it's titled Interview, Islamic Historian Amir Muhammad, Slaves Weren't Illiterate. I'll share a link in the video description. Now, the reason why I say a portion of that interview is relevant to the Facebook post we just looked at is because the gentleman being interviewed is also familiar with the church, has also had some experience with the church decades ago, and seems to provide secondary independent witness to a different description of the pews being prevalent back then, in decades past. So the brief clip I want to look at begins at the 58-minute and 15-second mark of the video. Now, as you listen to this short clip, listen closely to what he says about how the markings were described in the past.
As I stated earlier, there's a church in Savannah, Georgia, on the second floor. All of its pews has this when in the 70s they used to call it African scribble scrabble. Now they call it Arabic script or Jami script.
Okay, so those two claims strike me as especially fascinating when they are juxtaposed, when you put them side by side. As, like I said, we seem to have two different independent witnesses to a past from decades ago when the markings were being described differently, when they were perhaps not being described as Hebrew. One person remembers them being described as mere drawings, and another remembers them being described as, quote, African scribble scrabble, end quote. For me, that raises a couple important questions. The first question is this: how old is the claim that cursive Hebrew appears on the pews? Now, of course, I'm confident that some of the current proponents of the claim that Hebrew appears on the pews will insist that people have always known this to be the case, and thus they'll claim, or at least insinuate, that that the tradition of Hebrew on the pews goes all the way back to when the markings were first made. They'll say it goes all the way back to when the pews were built. However, in light of recent controversies, I personally am not so confident that we can simply take certain person's word for it, if you know what I mean. And that brings up a second question. What is the earliest recording of someone making that claim? In other words, people can assure us all they want that the claim that Hebrew, is on the pews has always existed since the 19th century for 150 years or maybe more, right? But it's more interesting to ask what is their earliest recording of the claim, whether in the form of a website or the printed word or maybe somebody's journal or a video, a radio broadcast, something. Now, as a disclaimer, that's not to say that the claim could not exist before our earliest extant recording of somebody making it, but it would at least be interesting if it turns out that we do not have evidence in favor of the claim existing before a certain point. especially in light of the recollections just shared, which seem to show that as recently as, say, 40 years ago or so, a little bit more than 30, 40 years ago, they were being described in a different way. The markings were being described in a different way. And it's here that I would invite others to contemplate the obvious disconnect from the alleged language on the pews, assuming there's language on the pews. Now, this has relevance here, and it also is going to have relevance to some other subtopics pertaining to the pews. So this issue of this disconnect is likely to come up in future videos on the subject. So, stay tuned for that. But getting back to this subject, what I'm referring to is the disconnect which is implied by no one knowing what the markings state. Some might want to object that, a friend of ours claims that an irregular spelling of Yisrael appears on a pew. And not only that, not too long ago, there was also the claim that a pew declared something along the lines of, quote, "Take grasp of Yah, Israel, with a bass voice," end quote. But those are very, very recent speculations, which were arrived at literally in the last few months. It's not like those are parts of traditions which stretch all the way back to the mid-19th century. And in fact, one of the proponents of those claims had himself said before those recent speculations arose that no one had been able to translate any part of the pews. And he is also on record, himself very recently in 2019, saying that he himself could not identify any words. He couldn't identify a single word. So, again, these recent attempts to show what's on the pews are not parts of traditions that stretch back. Rather, they're, very recent developments. And the reason why this is relevant is because, if we put aside those recent speculations and get back to the point of no one being able to translate the pews, and one of the more visible proponents saying, not so long ago that he couldn't even identify a single word, and this was the state of the pews as recently as like mid 2020, that implies a disconnect from the language on the pews, assuming there is language on the pews. And what I mean is, there are those who will claim that it has always been known that there's Hebrew on the pews, yet somehow this allegedly continuous line of tradition didn't bring the knowledge of what that Hebrew states with it. That has to be described as a disconnect. Now, another objection that I can anticipate is some might object by recalling that a little over a decade ago, there was a DVD in which one person claimed that the markings might be translated, quote, "to secure a desired harvest, to enter a pathway into a household," end quote. But, honestly, even there, no one has been able to point to a string of Hebrew characters on any of the pews which might be translated that way. In that regard, it's honestly a bit like our friends recently claiming that "Take grasp of Yah, Israel, with a bass voice" appeared on the pew, yet likewise couldn't produce the precise string of Hebrew characters behind that alleged English translation. And that is an example of what I would call a disconnect. If you have the markings and you have an English translation of the Hebrew that allegedly appears in those markings, yet you can't point to the actual Hebrew itself, that is a huge disconnect. And we know that some of these unsupported English translations are recent innovations. For example, again, that "Take grasp of Yah, Israel" line was a recent innovation. And so with that in mind, it's possible that the line about securing a harvest is likewise a recent innovation and not something rooted in, a 150-year-old tradition. Now, to tie that back in with the Facebook post and interview clip shown earlier in this video, perhaps the claim that Hebrew appears on the pews is itself a relatively recent innovation. Like, not only are the attempted translations recent innovations, perhaps the claim about Hebrew on the pews is itself a recent innovation. And the reason why we can entertain this possibility is because we have people who seem to remember a time, in the not so distant past, when the markings were being described rather differently. And when we come to the subject of no one being able to translate the alleged Hebrew on the pews, one might object that it's at least possible that, a group can know that there's Hebrew there, yet slowly lose their ability to read it over time. And sure, I'd agree, that's possible. It's possible for you to know there's language here, but, over the generations, you and your family slowly lose, the ability to read that. That can happen. However, and this is relevant to this video, it's also possible that another explanation for what's going on here is that the claim of Hebrew being on the pews was itself adopted more recently, and that proponents of that view are trying to collectively develop it and support it since it was adopted. And interestingly, we see development along those lines unfolding in real time. For example, claiming that that the alleged cursive Hebrew is more specifically solitreo seems to be a recent development. Claiming certain markings read, as we said before, take grasp of Yah Israel with a bass voice. That's definitely a recent development. Claiming an irregular spelling of Yisrael with 5 yods, a zayin, and no aleph is definitely a recent development. So the claims are evolving, and the attempts to provide examples in favor of the claims are very recent developments. So, if the arguments in favor of Hebrew on the pews are recent innovations, then the claim of Hebrew appearing on the pews itself might itself be a recent development, a recent innovation, Food for thought. On a closing note, one might object that, by these standards, so too the claim that Arabic appears on the pews might likewise be described as a recent development. And honestly, I would agree. You could raise the same charge. So too, one might object that just because a claim was arrived at recently, that does not mean it's false. In other words, Hebrew or Arabic or some other language might actually appear on a pew, even if people only recently started claiming such, even if it's only a relatively recent claim. Again, I would agree. But the point that I want to make here, as I close this video, is that there are certain folks who insinuate that, among the different language claims, that we should simply defer to the claim that Hebrew appears on the pews because that claim has existed continuously with the church since its beginnings. However, that sort of argument merely begs the question, is this tradition about Hebrew on the pews really that old? Does it really stretch back to the beginnings of the church? And are we merely expected to just take certain folks' word for it when they make this claim about how long the tradition has been around? When you look at the sort of statements that we saw at the beginning of this video, it seems possible that the claim is not as old as some have been telling us. Again, food for thought. And on that note, I'll close the video here. It's already more than 12 and a half minutes long, which is a lot longer than I thought it was going to be when I first started it. So, I'll close here. As I said, I've been somewhat busy, and that's why I've been inactive, and I'm going to be busy for a bit longer. So I'm going to be continue to be a bit inactive, but hopefully in the next, week or two or something like that, I can get back into the swing of things. I do have a number of other videos I'd like to make, some of them relevant to the pews and some of them relevant to other topics. On that note, as always, I look forward to the comments of others, and God bless. Have a great day, have a great morning, and a great rest of the day.